being here with you in this school, in high school, I was reminded of my high school years. I went to Rosemont High School, class of 81, St. Joseph's grade school. And when I was beginning my freshman year in high school, I was carrying a big secret inside that I didn't really want to tell anyone. It was a secret that was kind of heavy for me to carry. And for most of my freshman year, I hardly told anybody about it. But the secret was that my mom was sick. She was really sick, and she wasn't getting any better. She had cancer. And towards the end of my last month of my freshman year, she died. And for me, that sort of changed everything in my world. Changed the way I looked at everything. But I tried to go along, for the next 3 years of my high school, and I still didn't talk about it a whole lot, although it affected the way I looked at everything. In fact, I had to stop taking a lot of my life for granted. I had to start helping out at home more and taking care of things that couldn't be done otherwise. I had younger sisters and brothers. And I began to look at my relationships a whole lot differently. And then when I graduated, I went into the Air Force, and I was stationed in Germany. And it was there that this loss of my mother even became more important. It kind of raised a question in me. I was just questioning everything. I was even questioning God. And the question that came to me was just real simple, but for me, it was the most important thing in the world, as I'd said, where are you? And I never prayed like that before. But for some reason, I really needed to know, where are you, God? I wasn't sure if I believed in God. I remember going to Mass, and the priest would hold up the host, and he would say, the body of Christ. And I didn't know how I could understand that. I didn't know if I could believe that. I took it for granted my whole life, but all of a sudden, it mattered to me. Are you really there? And for the first time, I went to the priest, who I hardly knew, and I asked him the question, how is it that Jesus, God, is in that bread? I don't get it. Help me. I don't understand. Where is God? And the priest said, I'm so grateful he did, he said, that is a great question. And you had better stay with that question, because it's going to teach you and it's going to lead you. And the first place he said you might try to go to is to go to the scriptures. And he said, I would just recommend that you open up the Gospel of John and read it. And I'd studied the Bible, I had learned things in catechism, but I'd never really read it for an answer to my question. So the first thing I read were the story of the disciples meeting Jesus for the first time, and Jesus asked them a question. He said, what do you want? What is it that you want? And for me, it came right to my question, and that's the question they asked. They asked Jesus, where do you live? And I said, that's my question. That's what I want to know. Where are you? Where do you live? And Jesus answered by saying, come and see. And for me, that was an invitation to start looking a little bit differently. For the first time, the Bible was no longer just somebody else's story. I felt like God said something directly to me. I had never experienced that before. And I started noticing God's presence in ways I had never seen before. I was a runner at the time, and I'd be out in nature, and I would all of a sudden be just surprised by the beauty of nature, and I'd just stop sometimes. But I kept asking that question, where are you? Now this is 40 years later, but I'm still asking the question. The only thing that's changed in the last 40 years is I don't use the word where so much anymore. Now the question for me is how? Somewhere along the way, I came to trust that God is here. God is here now in the midst of whatever is going on in my life. And when I recognize it, that God is here, what a gift. And I can say thank you because I recognize you're here. Today in the gospel, we hear a story about loaves and fishes. For me, my little story, that's my loaves and fishes story. But today we hear another story, loaves and fishes, and it begins with a question. And for those of you who are students, you'll appreciate it because it's a test question. So here's the question. 5,000, maybe 10,000 people are gathered on the hill. And there's Jesus with all the disciples, and he goes to Philip and he says, here's a question for you, Philip. How much is it going to cost for us to feed all of these people? Imagine. They said there were 5,000 men. There could have been women and children, maybe 10, 15,000 people. This is the test question, it says. Jesus was testing Philip. What's the answer? Imagine it this way. If we were to get asked that question today, in the world today, there are over 800 million people who go with food every day. There are millions and millions of people who are without homes, who are immigrants, who are refugees. What if Jesus were going to ask us that question, like Philip? How much would it cost to feed all these people? How much would it cost for us to provide a home for all of these people? And so Philip's answer is this. He says, it's impossible. There's no way. We couldn't get enough money in a whole year of wages to pay this. He said, it's impossible. And then Jesus looks around, is that the best answer? And then Andrew comes forward, and he has another answer, but it's a gutsy answer. He says, well, there's a boy here, and he has 5 loaves of barley, which means he's poor, he has barley loaves, and 2 fish. What a gutsy call by Andrew to say, well, we've got 5 loaves and 2 fish for 15,000 people. And then he says, but what difference is that going to make? And then Jesus says, that's enough. Let's have everybody sit down. It sounds like this boy, that's my question, who is this boy? He's probably like one of you. You know, maybe 10, 12, 13, 14, not 18, he's a boy. And for some reason, he's part of this big crowd of people, and he hears about the need, and for whatever reason, he finds that he's got something to offer. Well, I've got 5 loaves and 2 fish. Here, you can have it. It's all I have. And Jesus said, that's what I want. And he said, that's what he lifted up before everybody. You see what this boy has offered? It's everything. And then he says, it's for that offering, he says, he gave thanks. And then the miracle begins to happen. There's a multiplication that happens. That when Jesus gives thanks for that, there is enough for everybody. And it says they were all satisfied. Amazing. Can you imagine 15,000 people all saying, we're all satisfied today? What a miracle. And I think with the message of this story, because it's the only miracle story that's in all of the Gospels, it's saying something about what Jesus is here to do. Because when Jesus came into the world, maybe the question would be, what would it cost for us to save this world from sin? What would it take? And Jesus says, I'll give you all that I have. He gave himself for us, and that's this vision of what God is doing. And in giving himself, one man giving all he had, it changed the world. There was a multiplication of grace and new life that began to satisfy people in a whole new way. This loaves and fishes story is an invitation to all of us that when you're willing to give all that you are to anything, whether it's your deep question or a gift that you have, a gift of yourself, God can do stuff with that. God can give thanks for that, and there can be a multiplication among us. So that story of the little boy, he has no name, but it could be any boy. Put your name to offer your 5 loaves and your 2 fish. And don't give in to the temptation to say, well, it's not very much. If it's who you are, that's what God is looking for, and that's what God can bless, and that's what God can multiply. And it's because of that boy's gift that the story goes on, and Jesus talks about another bread, the bread of life, the bread that we celebrate in the Eucharist, which is called Thanksgiving bread. But it all began with that boy offering who he is. I want to tell you just one more loaves and fishes story. When I was a little older in college, I had a chance to volunteer at a place called the Cancer Home in St. Paul. And I wanted to go there, I think, because my own mother died of cancer, and I wanted to go be with people who were dying of cancer. So I went, and my job was to feed people dying of cancer. And I ended up meeting this woman named Gertrude. Gertrude was paralyzed on one side, and on the other side she could barely move. So I had to feed her. She couldn't eat anything but pureed food. So I would feed her, and every time before we'd start, she'd talk like this. She'd say, "Oh, Ricky, I would like to pray before we do this." And I'd say, "Okay, Gertrude," and she'd say, "Dear God, thank you for everything, especially the chocolate pudding." Every time I'd come, I'd serve her chocolate pudding. And I'd look at that meal and I said, what could be possibly grateful about this? I almost got nauseous looking at it. But as I'd serve her the chocolate pudding, she'd always say, "Oh, my favorite." I'd never met somebody so grateful. And my being with her released this amazing gratitude. So today, as we gather here on this Thanksgiving Day, I might ask you, just to invite you to consider what might be your loaves and fishes story. Maybe it begins with a big question, a big need, and like the story, a big hunger. And how might that lead you and me to a big gift and a multiplication, and how God might surprise us. And where there is a gift, there can be gratitude.